Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I'm looking forward to the discussion because I think this is a point at which discussion is a really important element in our deliberations and concerning the lessons from the pandemic. But I thought I'd start my opening remarks with a story from a place about as far from where you are as from where I am, on the slopes of Mount Kenya. It's a district called Nyeri in Kenya, and it was once scattered with hundreds of wild fig trees, which are called mugumos in the local language, Kikuyu. Their tough bark was the color of elephant skin. Their gnarled roots drilled deep channels through the rocky earth to drink thirstily from the groundwater below. The trees bore a small round fruit which ripened in the sun to a warm orange color, and their branches were alive with the song of the tinkerbirds and turacos who feasted there. Wherever they grew, the mugomo trees threw a 60-foot canopy across lush, fertile undergrowth. Somewhere close by, you would always find a babbling stream set free by the roots from the groundwater below to offer a source of clean, safe drinking water for the families who lived in the region. One of those was the family of the late Wangari Maathai, scientist, activist, politician, winner of the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize and founder of the Greenbelt movement, which has since planted millions of trees across Africa. In her memoirs, Maathai described being sent to collect water and firewood from the slopes. Her mother would always remind her not to take wood from the tree itself, or even from the undergrowth around it. Why not? The young Wangari would ask. Because that's a tree of Ngai, the Kikuyu name for God, she was told. We don't use it, we don't cut it, we don't burn it. At the age of 20, Maathai left Nyeri to study science in the US as part of what was called the Kennedy Airlift. And it was almost a decade before she revisited her birthplace on the slopes of Mount Kenya. What she found there shocked and saddened her. The new owner of the land had cut down the trees to grow tea. The lush undergrowth had disappeared. The soil was arid. The stream that bubbled up from the earth where the roots had broken through rock had disappeared. Over and over again across Kenya, Wangari found the same story repeated. With the memory of childhood, she mourned its loss. With the eyes of a scientist, she grasped its devastating logic. Without the fig tree, there was no easy access to the groundwater. Without its shade, the undergrowth was lost. Without its roots, the soil became unstable. Landslides devastated the mountainous slopes. The drinking water dried up. The birds fell silent. The land and its people suffered the consequences. Her mother's simple folklore, swept away by the advance of Western capitalism, had coded for a deep protection of the fragile ecosystem, the basis for a resilience that has now gone forever. Maathai's is just one of the many stories that have brought inspiration to me and to countless others, of course, in the intervening decades. And so it was to her and to others that I turned when I sat down to write Post-Growth: Life After Capitalism, shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic 2 years ago. And even as I was sitting down to write, a young Chinese doctor named Li Wenliang had alerted the world to a new and unfamiliar virulent strain of coronavirus that had broken out in an area of Wuhan city in China. He'd been roundly reprimanded for his pains, and in a matter of days, he would be dead. A heroic statistic on the alarmingly exponential curve of an escalating pandemic. Li would be the first of many unnecessary and utterly preventable deaths as frontline workers lost their lives caring for others. Within weeks, the global economy would be plunged into an existential crisis. Denial would turn to confusion. Confusion would turn to expediency. Expediency would overturn everything. Normalcy would evaporate more or less overnight. Businesses, homes, communities, whole countries went into lockdown. Even the preoccupation with growth would diminish momentarily in the urgency to protect people's lives. Alongside an uncomfortable reminder of what matters most in life, we were being given a history lesson in what economics looks like when economic growth disappears completely. And one thing came clear very rapidly: it looks nothing like anything the modern world has seen before. The world starts to shake, wrote the sociologist Peter Berger, in the very instant that its sustaining conversation begins to falter. It's not just food and shelter that sustains life, Berger was saying. It's the myths we cling to, the stories we tell ourselves, and our beliefs about what matters in life. These are as elemental to us as physical sustenance is. And when they go missing, we feel their loss viscerally. The world becomes a less secure, less comforting place. Over the last 2 years, our sustaining conversation didn't just falter, it did an abrupt about turn and slapped us in the face hard. No wonder then that even now, the world still feels a little shaky, perhaps even shakier today than it did 18 months ago. With the vaccine rollout offering glimmers of light, there's a slow expectation that our lives will soon get back to some kind of normal. But a strange shadow pandemic of social anxiety accompanies the relief we're beginning to feel. Getting back to work has become a mental as well as a physical challenge. I recently spoke at a live event for the first time in well over a year. And as the day approached, I felt I was falling into a deep unknown, which is curious because I wasn't. It was a situation I'd been in my whole professional life. But it was also a world away from the routine of Zoom calls and social distancing that had characterized the previous 18 months or so. Some, I know, have rejected that old routine entirely. They resent the wasted hours traveling on crowded trains to jobs that occupy the days and pay the bills, but somehow seem empty and meaningless now. They're looking for some less punishing path towards security, happier sometimes to make do with less, to retain that simpler way of life uncovered by accident under the duress of the crisis. A different sustaining conversation. And there were some, of course, whose jobs became a living nightmare under the conditions of the pandemic. The nurses, the doctors, the care workers, the teachers, the checkout clerks, shelf stackers, the cleaners and the delivery drivers. These were the frontline workers, overworked and underpaid long before the crisis struck, hounded by a decade of austerity and dangerously exposed to the virus itself. These were the people we applauded from our doorsteps a year or so ago, rightly so. They saved our lives. Suddenly, overnight, we began to understand which tasks in society really matter. But there was something massively ironic in this realization, farcical if it hadn't been so tragic. These were precisely the jobs which had been systematically undervalued for years. A study of food and farming conducted the year before the outbreak made an astonishing and shameful finding. Even in a rich country like the UK, there were farm workers who could not afford to feed themselves properly. Those responsible for providing the economy's most basic service had to visit the rapidly rising number of food banks just to stay alive. This is such an extraordinary perversion of economic value that it has to be witnessed to be believed. The entire concept of a market economy and its advantage over a subsistence economy is that labor can generate what economists like to call a surplus. We can exchange this surplus for income and spend it on things that others have produced. That's how a market economy should operate. Yet here were workers in the most vital sector in the economy, unable even to feed themselves and their families without resorting to charity. How did the values of our economic system become so distorted? How did we manage so spectacularly to fail those who turned out to play such a vital role in our well-being? Why did we agree to a decade of austerity which left our frontline workers facing unrealistic productivity targets and leading stressed, overburdened lives? If we don't answer these questions now, before we rush back into a world of work that was broken long before the pandemic, we'll end up making the same mistakes again. But we mustn't entirely expect the answers to be easy. The roots of the problem lie deep inside a capitalistic system that prizes productivity above service and puts profit before care for one another. And in elevating productivity above all else, we diminish the meaning of work itself. Labor is seen as a cost to producers, to be reduced or eliminated as far as possible by replacing people with machines, for example, and as a sacrifice to workers to be endured at best and only in exchange for wages. The ideal, from the point of view of the employer, is to have output without employees, concluded the author of Small is Beautiful, E.F. Schumacher. And the ideal from the point of view of the employee is to have income without employment. The care economy suffers most from this dysfunctional logic, precisely because its value lies inherently in the time we spend in service to each other. Care takes time. Nurses are undervalued because they care. In her classic work on the human condition, the philosopher Hannah Arendt makes a fascinating distinction between labor and work, words that we often use interchangeably. Labor is precisely this visceral work of care that I've been talking about, and the importance of it in maintaining and nurturing human life and health. Arendt points out that as soon as we lift our eyes from this visceral immersion in the task of labor with sufficient time to look around ourselves, we're immediately confronted with an even bigger challenge, the prospect of our own mortality. And it's a prospect that demands a response. We need some way of thinking of ourselves beyond the short span of the individual human life. Work, said Arendt, is the task of building a sense of durability in the world, whether through long-lasting products or monuments or works of art. It's about the things that take us beyond the span of an individual life and give us the power and the resources to come to terms with our own mortality. And as Arendt points out, capitalism undermines both labor and work. Durability is inimical to capitalism. It's the last thing capitalism wants, because if things last, there's no need for new things. We're missing out on the visceral rewards of labor and the creative rewards of work. In the capitalist equation, we are missing precisely what allows human beings to participate in society. In denigrating labor, in undermining the durability of work, we're also undermining the happiness that these things can bring to us as human beings in society. Participation in the life of society, a sense of durability beyond our own individual life. And that's a way of reclaiming a sense of meaning and purpose. And my point here, as in many other examples that I've used in the book and that I'm using in this talk is not simply to bemoan the failings of capitalism, but to recognize and address the faults of a dysfunctional economic system so that we can redefine the foundations for what we want to protect in the new one. None of the lessons from the pandemic are easy, nor can we avoid them by retiring into some kind of extended self-isolation, tempting though that may be. Our world has been profoundly shaken. Its sustaining conversation has decidedly altered. But in the ruins of a broken system lie the seeds of renewal, a chance to tell a different story about what matters in our lives and build a better economy in service to it. Ask people what matters most in their lives, and the chances are that health will come out somewhere near the top. Health for ourselves, health for our friends and our families, health too sometimes for the fragile planet on which we live and on whose health we ourselves depend. And that same lesson must surely top the ones that we learned over the last 2 years. As COVID spread, there was a sense everywhere of priorities being reshuffled. Without health, all routes to well-being become impassable. The trappings of material affluence, hitherto sacred to our vision of prosperity, seem at best ephemeral and at worst irrelevant. Yet as the epidemiological and ideological battles over vaccination now attest, those precious lessons were both hard won and swiftly forgotten. A matter of months after we applauded our nurses in the UK from the doorstep, they were offered the paltriest of pay rises. And now once again, our carers find themselves at the mercy of a cold economic calculus. Society will be forever the poorer if we forego this opportunity to ask what kind of economy we now need, what kind of recovery we should aim for, what can prosperity possibly mean for a promiscuous species on a finite planet? The question is almost as old as the hills, of course, but the contemporary answer to it is paralyzingly narrow, cast in the garb of late capitalism. Prosperity has been captured by the ideology of eternal growth, a mantra which insists that more is always better, despite overwhelming evidence that relentless expansion is undermining nature and driving us towards a devastating climate emergency. The myth of growth still remains and reigns supreme. The planetary damage caused by this expansionary zeal is compounded by another very human cost. Capitalism needs selfish, insatiable consumers to achieve its ambitions for growth. So it incentivizes that kind of behavior. It lionizes those who excel at it. And simultaneously, it undervalues the tasks that matter most to society and denigrates those who labor there. Capitalism has gaslighted us into accepting a tainted view of ourselves and a tawdry substitute for human fulfillment. If we are to have any chance of living well within the limits of the planet, we must dethrone the myths that haunt economics. We must see them for what they are, rather than the hard-nosed truths they claim to be. To reclaim our humanity, we must look elsewhere for our governing metaphors. To turn at this point to the idea of prosperity itself as health is to do more than to reiterate the lessons of the pandemic. As Aristotle pointed out in his Nicomachean Ethics, a book which was named after his physician father, the good life must always be seen not as the continual pursuit of more, but as a fine line between deficiency and excess. Balance rather than growth is the governing metaphor of health. Population health provides the most obvious example of this idea. Too little food, and we're struggling with diseases and malnutrition. Too much, and we're tipped into the diseases of affluence, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, that now kill more people than undernutrition does, according to the World Health Organization. Good health depends on us finding and nurturing this sense of balance. And that task is always tricky, of course, even at the individual level. Just think about the challenge of keeping your exercise, your diet, your appetites in line with the outcome of a healthy body weight. But living inside a system that has its sights continually focused on more makes the task near impossible. Capitalism not only fails to recognize the point where balance lies, it has no idea how to stop when it gets there. The focus on health triggered by the coronavirus was a vindication of the wisdom conveyed more than 2 centuries ago by Thomas Jefferson. The care of human life and happiness, and not its destruction, he said, is the first and only task of government. As we reorient ourselves to new realities, the lessons of the last year and a half or so offer us a unique opportunity to rebalance both our individual lives and our sense of social progress. It is health rather than wealth that lies at the heart of our well-being and provides the true foundation for a lasting prosperity. Ultimately, Post-Growth, the book that I published last year, is a kind of intellectual journey with one simple question at its heart: how should we live? It recognizes that capitalism has no answers and no longer works. It's a catalogue of system errors. It's overturned the principle of balance in human health, relentlessly insisting that more is better. It's denigrated care, continually depressing the value of the carer. It's overstimulated consumer appetites, ruthlessly arousing dissatisfaction. It's accelerated material throughput, dangerously undermining the integrity of the natural world. Capitalism has overturned the world-building task of work. It's tipped our unending search for security into a relentless and inevitable insecurity. It's transformed investment from a canopy of hope into a dystopian gambling casino. It systematically privileges the returns to capital over the livelihoods of ordinary people. And in doing this, it's destabilized finance, accelerated inequality, and compromised our health. The starkest lesson of all is that it needn't be like this. With an alacrity that was almost shocking, the coronavirus revealed what capitalism has long denied, that it is possible for governments to intervene in the health of society, dramatically if necessary, to furlough workers, to protect livelihoods, to invest in care, to build hospitals, to use the sovereign money, the sovereign power over money itself, a power denied for ideological reasons by those who would profit from tragedy, as a legitimate vehicle for change. My aim in Post-Growth was to search in the ruins of capitalism for the seeds of renewal. And the answers I sought drew inevitably on the decade or so of lessons learned since the publication of an earlier book that was mentioned at the beginning of this session, Prosperity Without Growth, which by a quirk of fate first appeared as a government report 12 years to the day before Post-Growth was published. But aside from that strange coincidence and the obvious parallel focus on the dilemmas of growth, the 2 books are very different from one another. Post-Growth wasn't written for policymakers. It isn't trying to persuade government or convince them what to do on Monday. It doesn't have a great deal in the way of graphs and figures, numbers and statistics. And I doubt very much that the current UK Prime Minister is going to wish it had never been written, as former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown did when the earlier report was published. I guess it was written for all the people that prosperity without growth wasn't written for, but perhaps should have been, the ones who, in a dramatic turn of events in the days that followed the launch of that early work, began to download the report in their tens of thousands, and the ones who for more than a decade went on inviting me to banks and boardrooms, to village halls and community centres, to theatres and libraries, because they were keen to have exactly the discussion that the governments of the day resolutely didn't want to have. What can prosperity possibly mean on a finite planet? Post-growth is as much a prequel as it is a sequel to prosperity without growth. It dares to imagine a world beyond capitalism, a place where relationship and meaning take precedence over profit and power. It is in some sense a manifesto for system change, but it's also an invitation to rekindle a deeper conversation about the nature of the human condition. And there's no doubt in my mind that task is as timely now as it's ever been. Even today, in the midst of change, we remain obsessed with economic growth. Post-growth is a way of thinking about what might happen when that possession, that obsession is over, as one day it must be. It invites us to explore new frontiers for social progress. It points us in the direction of uncharted terrain, an unexplored territory in which plenty isn't measured in dollars and fulfillment isn't driven by the relentless accumulation of material wealth. Life after capitalism had been, for me, at first, a kind of tentative, almost speculative subtitle for the book, an invitation to the reader to imagine our prevailing economic paradigm as a temporary thing, a barely surviving remnant of old ways of being, not as the immovable, immutable truth it presumes itself to be. And then in the early months of writing, capitalism was taken apart piece by piece in an astonishing effort to save lives and rescue normalcy. During the year 2020 in particular, the world witnessed the most extraordinary experiment in non-capitalism that we could possibly imagine. And we now know that such a thing is not only possible, it's essential under certain circumstances. The goal of post-growth was to articulate the opportunities that await us in this vaguely glimpsed hinterland, from the slopes of Mount Kenya to the University of Kansas, from the horror of Nazi Germany to the atrocities of the Vietnam War, from the ancient wisdom of the Chinese sage Lao Tzu to the civil disobedience of a Swedish schoolgirl, Greta Thunberg. I wanted to draw together a coherent narrative for our time, a different story from the one we have consigned ourselves to, a canopy of hope, much like the one provided by the Mugumo trees where Wangari Maathai was born, a source of inspiration, drawing on deep currents that still run beneath the deceptive surface of capitalism, a clear spring to sustain our thirst for renewal. Since its publication last year, I've become convinced that the task I began in post-growth, much like the one I started in prosperity without growth, is just the first step in a continuing journey. Its job right now is to help us reflect honestly on the situation we find ourselves in. Its deeper task is to lift our eyes from the ground of a polluted economics and glimpse a new way of seeing what human progress might mean. Soon, it won't be needed, but its power for today is to free our lips from the mantra of yesterday and allow us to articulate a better tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.